Our next speaker is Karl Szpunar. Karl is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Harvard University in Dan Schachter's lab. He'll be starting soon a position as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he cleverly deferred it for a year. So this next year, as everyone is telling him, will be his last year of pure freedom of pursuing everything research-wise before everything that happens with assistant professor hits you. And I'm very glad that you can spend some of that time with us today. I actually met Karl last year at Psychonomics, and Karl is actually planning to do a study here in our new live lab facility. And Karl's done some excellent work on mind wandering and its effect on lecturing. And we'll hear from Karl today. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here today. What I'd like to do is just to tell you about some research that my collaborators and I have been working on for about the last year and a half or so. What we're really trying to pin down is how we can control mind wandering in lecture-based settings. I'm going to give you a good reason why we want to try to do that. So as educators, when we come into our classrooms, this is sort of like the ideal thing that we want to be seeing from our students. We want to see students who are intently focused or appear to be intently focused on what we're teaching them, and if we were to sample the content of their thoughts, we would see that indeed they are actually paying attention to what we're teaching, but in reality we know that this is often not the case. Oftentimes if you were to ask any student at any time, hey, what are you thinking about right now? It's not necessarily anything to do with what we're trying to teach them. And there's a good deal of research showing that mind wandering can actually get in the way of effective learning. And so how can we help to sort of get around these types of issues? And so what I really want to do today is tell you about two lines of work that we've been developing. One has to do with some behavioral research, a second line has to do with neural imaging, and both sort of directed at understanding how mind wandering works in these types of settings. So for the first part of the talk, I'll tell you about a behavioral intervention that we've been working with, whereby we introduce tests into actual lectures, and I'll show you how that has influences on attention and memory for those lectures. After that, I'm going to tell you about some more recent work we've been doing to follow up on that, where we're really trying to understand how much does it matter in terms of when we present those tests, and how important is it to introduce those tests very early on in the lecture to sort of give students a reason to pay attention. So I'll tell you a bit about that. During the second part of the talk, I want to focus on what we're calling the neural substrates of focused learning. And this is something that I think is very interesting. Students learn from lectures on a daily basis, and not just once, multiple times, they go class to class to class. We know almost next to nothing about how the brain is involved in what happens when students are in these situations. And what we've started doing is having students watch lectures in the fMRI scanner, and we're using novel analysis techniques to get a sense of how different brain networks interact with one another, and how testing can actually mediate those interactions. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that. And then lastly, depending on how much time there is at the end, I want to tell you about sort of the culmination of everything we've been doing. And that's going to sort of result in collaboration with members of the live lab, whereby we're going to try to introduce brain imaging into an actual classroom-based setting. So I'll tell you a bit about that as well. Okay, so to start with, this behavioral intervention we're working with. And the types of things we're concerned about, it's nothing new. Educators for a long time have stressed that the way we lecture is not the most effective way to pass along information. One of the biggest problems is just that most lectures are extremely long. They can range anywhere from 30 to 40 to 60 to 120 minutes. If you're lucky, you might get 1 5-minute break in there. Otherwise, you're expected to be taking information over long periods of time. And a lot of educators have said, well, we should be doing something different. We should be changing up or mixing up our lectures with various activities to sort of help keep students engaged. And this is a great suggestion, but when you look in the literature, there's really not much there to give you a convincing argument about what I should be doing. A lot of studies lack appropriate control conditions, so you just don't know if something is actually helping. And so that's where we sort of got interested in this. And what we really wanted to focus on was what might be the role of evaluation. And what I mean by that is that when most students come into a lecture, they know they're not responsible for anything they're going to learn at that moment for a very long period of time, potentially until a midterm or a final exam that can come days, weeks, or even months so what can we do about that? What we wanted to do is, well, what if we change that? What if we break up our lectures into smaller, more manageable segments and test people during the lectures along the way and give them an incentive to actually pay attention? Can that in any way change how well students are learning information in these settings? Okay, so how did we do this? The first thing we wanted to do was to choose a lecture that we would expect to have a reasonably high amount of mind wandering during. And just in speaking to students and our own personal experiences, if there's any statistics teachers here, I apologize. That's what, every time you talk to students about what is the one thing that you have the most trouble with, that you have the most trouble paying attention to, this is what always comes up, so we figured why not. We took the first 20 minutes of an intro to statistics lecture that's offered at Harvard University. We brought in Harvard undergraduates. And what we told them is, you're going to be, as you're learning from this lecture, what you're going to notice is that it's actually going to be broken up into 4 smaller segments that are each about 5 minutes long. And the reason we're doing this is that we don't want to overwhelm you with all the information you're going to be learning, so we just want to give you a break every now and then. And at each break point, we're actually going to have you complete 2 activities for us. And so those activities were, we told them that once the segment sort of fades off of the screen, first we're just going to ask you to answer some math problems for us. These are completely unrelated to the content of the lecture, just simple multiplication, again, just to get clear your mind. And then after you do these math problems, one of 2 things is going to happen. You're either going to answer a few more math problems, or you might get some questions about the most recent part of the lecture you had just learned. And for those of you who are curious about what kind of questions we're using, they're just very simple cue recall, where we're really just trying to sort of see if they're grasping key concepts we want to walk away with. So what's the relationship between a population sample, and they have an X amount of time to give us an answer for that. Now the key thing is we tell students that as you go through the lecture, the number of times we're going to test you is going to be totally random. So you might be tested after each and every one of the 4 segments. You might be tested after only 1 or 2 of the segments, or you might never be tested at all. But before you leave today, we're going to give you a final cumulative test about the entire lecture. So even if you're not being tested along the way, your best bet is just pay as good attention as you can and try to learn as well as you can. So everyone gets the same instructions. In reality, we actually had 2 groups of participants. So for one group, we actually gave them a test or a quiz after each of the 4 segments, and we can just call this group our tested group. And for the second group of participants, we actually only ever gave them a test after the 4th and final segment of the lecture. And for the lack of a better term, we can just call this group our non-tested group. And what this between participants design allows us to do is it allows us to see, first of all, how well are students learning from that 4th and final segment, depending on whether or not we've been testing them earlier on in the lecture. And the reason we care about this so much is that whenever students or people in general have to sit down and learn over an extended time period, when you get to the end of that long learning sequence, it's very hard to absorb new information. There's a lot of reasons why this happens, but you don't even have to look at lectures. You can look at how people are learning from word lists. Catherine Rawson's done some nice stuff in context of reading. Pretty much anything. When you get to the end of a very long study sequence, you have a tough time picking up new information. And so we want to see, does testing people on information before you get to the end of this long study sequence, does it actually help you to sort of take in what comes towards the end? But of course, we're also interested in more directly trying to assess how well are they actually paying attention to what's going on. So what we told them at the outset of the study was that there was going to be an experimenter in the room with them, and every now and then the experimenter is going to ask if you happen to be mind-wandering. We explained to them exactly what we meant by that. They never knew how often this was going to happen. They just knew that whenever they heard that question, they just respond yes or no. And the way we did this was that at one random point during each segment of the lecture, the students were asked this question. So now we can see, does testing have any influence on sort of the propensity of students to mind-wander during lectures? Okay. And so before we get to the data, I want to address one potential confound in our design. And that is that when we're looking at mind-wandering and learning during a lecture, when we compare our tested and non-tested group, if the tested group is doing better in any way, sure, they might be doing better because they're engaging in retrieval practice, but it could also be the case that as they're engaging in retrieval practice, they're just re-exposing themselves to lecture content. So it could be re-exposure to the materials that's really driving anything we're seeing. And so to get around this issue, we actually introduced a 3rd group of participants into our study, and we called this group our restudy group. And the restudy group was for all intents and purposes, the exact same as the tested group with one key difference. For the first 3 segments of the lecture, when they got the questions, they also got the answers with the question. They didn't have to generate any answer. And so now when we look at our tested and our non-tested group, if we see any benefits of testing, if that has anything to do with re-exposure to lecture materials, then that restudy group should be doing at least as well as the tested group, if not better, because the restudy group gets the answers to all the questions. The tested group answers only the ones they can. If instead, though, this has something to do with retrieval practice, then that tested group should still be doing the best. So that was our reasoning for all this. Okay. So what does the data look like? So first we're going to look at mind wandering, and I want to show you what's happening with this non-tested group. That's the first data point I want to direct your attention to. And what we see is that 40% of the time when the students are asked, do you have any mind wandering, they say, yes, I was. I know I shouldn't have been, but something else came to mind, and I'm sorry about that. And to me, this is a very striking data point for 2 reasons. One is, remember, the experimenter is in the room with the participants. The participants know that the experimenter is going to be checking on their attention during this study, and still 40% of the time, they just cannot help but to have this mental experience. The other reason why I think that this is so fascinating is when you look at studies of mind wandering in actual classroom settings where students might actually be learning something that they really need to know, you see estimates that are pretty much this high. So it's just a very pervasive phenomenon in this type of educational setting. And so what we wanted to see is, does testing help to reduce mind wandering? And in fact, what we found is that yes, it did. We were able to cut mind wandering in half to about 20%, so that was really nice. And we've been able to replicate this basic finding a number of times now in our lab. And now the key piece of data here is what's happening with that restudy group. Does this have anything to do with retrieval practice, or is it just re-exposure? We see that for the restudy group, it makes absolutely no difference. If you're not actually thinking that you have to answer these questions along the way, then you're not benefiting. Okay. So we're very excited about this. But of course, the one thing we're interested in is not only how well are students paying attention, but how engaged are they in the learning process. And mind wandering isn't a very good gauge of that in some sense. Just because you're not mind wandering doesn't mean that you're actively engaged in the learning process. So we wanted a bit more of a direct measure of that. And in order to get that, what we did is at the outset of the study, we actually gave students all the lecture slides associated with the lecture. And we told them you can use these slides in any way that you would like. If you want to take down additional notes or do anything with it, you can. If not, that's fine too. Whatever you would naturally do to help yourself learn, that's what we want you to do. We sent them on their way. And then at the end of the study, we actually took those slides back from students, and as just a very cursory measure of student engagement, we just checked to see for what proportion of slides did students jot down additional notes to help them understand what was going on in the lecture. And what we see is that if you're being tested along the way, you're almost 3 times as likely to be doing this. So it seems like the testing is not only helping students to stay more attentive, but they're also more engaged in the learning process. And then lastly, the thing that we care most about is how well are they actually learning towards the end of the lecture, where we know students have a lot of difficulty typically. What we find is that if you test people on the first parts of the lecture, when you get to something completely brand new that's presented at the end of the lecture, that previous testing gives you a very strong benefit for having been tested previously. So you're paying better attention, you're more engaged, and ultimately, you're just doing a more effective job of taking in the information that you learn from the lecture. All right, so we've been very fascinated by this pattern of results, and we've been trying to figure out, how exactly should we be placing these tests, how important is any one test that you put during a lecture. And what we really wanted to focus on initially after we got this sort of pattern of data was how important is it for that first test to be there to reinforce this idea, oh yeah, you actually may be tested as you're going along here. And so just to give you a sense of how we got at this question, this is the same paradigm that we just went over. We're just going to make a few changes to this paradigm to address this new question that we're interested in. So the first thing we can do is we can actually just get rid of this non-tested group. Remember, the non-tested restudy groups perform almost identically. The restudy group, if anything, better approximates or controls for different factors compared to the tested group. So we just decided to use this one. It really shouldn't matter anyways. And just to be more clear, we can call these groups, instead of tested and restudied, we can just call these our 4-test and our 1-test groups. And now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce another group that we call our 3-test group. And this 3-test group is just like the 4-test group, except they're not tested after that first segment. And And what we want to see is how important is it to get that reinforcement of, oh yes, you will be tested, you get that right away, as opposed to having that be delayed a little bit. How well is that 3-test group going to be learning the rest of the lecture as compared to the group that was tested on that first segment? Okay, so first I want to show you what's happening in terms of the mind wandering. Let's take a look at that 4-test and 1-test group. This just basically replicates the pattern of data we've been finding across a few studies we've done. Now the key thing is what's happening with that 3-test group. If you're not tested after that first segment and you sort of learn the lecture the rest of the way as if you were in the 4-test group, how are you doing? What we see is that mind wandering, we just can't seem to get mind wandering down that much. So having that, as soon as, at least one way we're thinking about this data is that when you have the experience of will or will not be tested and you realize, oh, I may not be tested here, something happens where the mind wandering just sort of kicks in and it's just very hard to get it back down. Okay, and what's happening in terms of learning? So I'm going to break down the data across all 4 segments here. First, I'm just going to show you the data for the 4-test group. We can't really make any meaningful comparisons across the 4 segments. We're not counterbalancing the order of the segments of the lecture or randomizing them. So that first segment's probably, it could just be a lot easier. But we can use this as a baseline to compare against our other groups. So first, for that 1-test group, we see how well are they learning that 4th segment. We see just like with our previous studies, they're not doing as well. But now the really important thing is how well is that 3-test group learning segments 2, 3, and 4 if they weren't tested on the first segment. And we see that they're just not doing as well as the group that was tested on that first segment. You can see that by the time they get to that 4th segment, they're getting pretty close to getting sort of recovering potentially, but we just need to do a lot more work to understand what's happening there. But if you collapse the data across segments 2 through 4, what we find is that the 4-test group is doing better than the 3-test group. So just having that initial reinforcement seems to be pretty important. And those differences translate into a final cumulative test. That 4-test group does better than the other groups. Okay, so what I want to do now is switch gears a little bit and tell you about what we've been learning in terms of how the brain might be involved in all this. Again, it's something that we know absolutely nothing about, but most of our learning in university college settings happens this way. Whether or not we like it, everyone always says we should be doing something different other than lecturing, but very few people change the way they approach it. So given that that's the current state of affairs, I think it would be very important to understand how the brain is involved and what they can tell us about how we approach education. And so what we did in this study, so there were 48 participants that we put into 2 groups. And we just took the tested and non-tested group from our previous experiments. So here we're using the non-tested group as the control condition. Again, remember the non-tested and restudy really don't make it too much a difference which one you're using. The reason we went with the non-study group, or the non-tested group, is because this is an fMRI study. It costs a lot of money to do this. If anything, the non-tested group does a little bit worse than the restudy group, so we just want to make sure that we're going to be finding the behavioral results that we're expecting. And this study is exactly the same as what we do in the lab. The only difference is that students are in the scanner, and we scan them as they watch each segment of the lecture. We just tell them, just lie still, relax, try to learn from the lecture as well as you can. The only difference now is they're not able to take notes as if they were in a regular class. But nonetheless, they're trying to learn from the lecture as well as they can. And in between each scan, we give them a chance to verbally respond to math and test questions, if in fact they are getting test questions. And just because we have a limited amount of time to go over some of this stuff today, what I really want to focus on is what's happening during this 4th and final segment of the lecture. The numbers you see up there is how well the tested and non-tested group are performing on the 4th and final segment. You see now we have a very big difference. It usually ranges anywhere from 20 to 30%. Here they weren't allowed to take any notes either. Maybe that even hurts the non-tested group a bit more. Either way, we have a very big difference. And what we want to see is what might be happening in the brain that can help us to better understand why the tested group is doing so much better than the non-tested group. And this leads to an important question. How do we even analyze data like this? We're having them sit there and watch a 5-minute segment of the lecture. How do we make sense of what's going on? And one thing you can do when you have participants do this, and they can be doing pretty much anything. We're having them watch lectures. You can just have them lie in the scanner and look at a fixation cross or do pretty much anything you want. If you have them doing it for this long period of time, what you can do is you can say, I want to know what my estimate of neural activity looks like in this brain region over that entire time period. And here I've just highlighted a region of motor cortex, and this comes from a figure actually from Randy Buckner's lab at Harvard University. And if you ask what that estimate of neural activity looks like over that long period of time, what you usually tend to see is something like this, is that there seem to be almost random fluctuations over the entire time course. But then what you can ask is, are there any other regions in the brain that show similar fluctuations over time? And the really interesting thing is that there are. So if you were looking at a region of motor cortex, what you would find is that the entire motor network shows a very highly correlated pattern of activity over time. And what people take these type of data to mean is that all of these regions probably make up a network that is working together and that's sharing information in the service of accomplishing common goals. And what I want to do now is tell you about 3 other networks in the brain that have been identified using these types of beams that I think are going to be very important to helping us understand what happens when students try to learn from lectures. Okay, so these are those networks. I'm going to go over each one of them in turn just to give you a sense of how I think they might be relevant. I hope that comes out okay. So the first one is what we call the dorsal attention network. And this network is just a set of regions that tend to come online whenever we're engaged in a task that requires us to stay focused on something in our external environment. And so if you think about what a student has to do in the classroom, they have to pay attention to what the instructor's saying, they have to pay attention to what's going on in the slides, they have to pay attention to their notes, they have to be aware of potential distractions. It seems like this network would be very important for helping us to accomplish that. Of course, we know that students aren't always able to accomplish that, and every now and then they fall into bouts of mind-wandering, where they start to think about things from their past or their future. And sure enough, we know that there's another network in the brain that helps us accomplish that, and that's what we call the default network. And this is just a set of regions that work together to help us generate internal thoughts about our own lives. And so one way I like to think about this is that as a student sitting in a lecture, what you might effectively have is this tug of war between the dorsal attention network and the default network. What we want to know is how can we help that dorsal attention network win out and help them keep them engaged on what's going on around them as opposed to focusing on anything that's going on in their own lives. And so in order to understand how these networks actually interact with one another, we actually have to consider the role of a third network that Dan actually alluded to earlier today. That's called the frontal parietal control network. And this network is very interesting because regions of this network actually fall in between regions of the dorsal attention and the default network. And there's some really nice work that's been done by Nathan Sprain, who's now at Cornell University, and he used to be a fellow postdoc in Dan's lab. And what he showed is that whenever you engage in a task where you're really trying very hard to stay focused on what's going on around you, that regions of this frontal parietal control network will actually link up with regions of the dorsal attention network to help it win that tug of war. Conversely, if you're engaged in a task where you're trying very hard to focus on the details of your own thoughts, so when you're trying to remember details of a personal memory or something that could happen in your future, what you see instead is that regions of this frontal parietal control network actually start to link up with regions of the default network to help it win that tug of war. And so what do I mean by that? What do I mean that this frontal parietal control network can link up with one network or another? And I mean, really all I mean by that is if we go back to this idea of looking at the fluctuation activity over time, just to give you an example, if you're engaged in a task where you're really trying to pay attention to what's going on around you, and you see very highly correlated patterns of activity in the dorsal attention network, it's working, all those regions are working together to help you do that. What happens is that regions of this frontal parietal control network start to take on those properties, and now these two networks are showing very highly correlated patterns of activity, suggesting that they're working together to keep you engaged. And so what does that mean for our study? Remember, with this tested group, we're testing them on segment 1, segment 2, segment 3. By the time they get to that 4th segment, we know from our prior research that they should be doing a pretty good job of staying focused on what's going on around them. And so if that's the case, and if how the frontal parietal control network interacts with the dorsal attention network and default network gives us a clue of how that might be working in the brain, one very simple prediction we can make is for that tested group, the connectivity between the frontal parietal control network should be stronger with the dorsal attention network than the default network. And for our non-tested group, perhaps we won't see this differentiation because we haven't done anything to tip the balance in the favor of the dorsal attention network. And when we look at our data, that's exactly what we see. If you've been tested throughout the lecture, what we're seeing with this frontal parietal control network is stronger connectivity with the dorsal attention network than the default network, and that difference isn't coming out for the non-tested group. And again, I don't have too much time to go into the specifics of the data, but parts of this data are very strongly correlated with how well they actually end up performing later on. So it's very, very interesting, and it's giving us a sense that how this frontal parietal control network operates can be very informative to helping us understand how well students are able to pay attention to these types of materials that they learn on a daily basis. And just to give you a sense that it's the interactions between these networks that we want to be focusing on, when we look at connectivity within these networks, we see that our manipulation has absolutely no effect. It's only when you look at how the frontal parietal control network is interacting with the dorsal attention default network that we start to see something interesting. Okay, so just to conclude, what I'd like to do is just give you a sense of where we want to be going with this, and in particular what we're going to plan to do with the live lab, just because I think this is such an exciting facility to have, and there's so many things that you can do there. So, one thing that we were always worried about with what we're doing is that this is a between participants manipulation, and so how do you get around that in an actual classroom? And the really nice thing with the live lab environment is you can use these personal response tablets where you can personalize what condition anyone's going to be in, and they're going to get that manipulation on their tablet. They can sit anywhere in the class that they want, and we can now have, in the context of one classroom, our between participants manipulation. And then the really cool thing about the environment, of course, is that we're going to be able to use EEG and various physiological measures to start to give us a sense of not only what's happening in the brain as students are learning in the context of an actual classroom with other students, but also how various physiological measures might be tracking things like learning and mind wandering. And I guess the last thing I want to focus on is these arousal measures, because one thing that we always hear from people is, okay, well, if you keep testing during a lecture, are people just never going to want to attend those lectures because they're going to be too freaked out that I'm going to be tested all the time, and they're just not even going to be able to focus because they're too worried about the test. And so doing a study like this is going to give us some sense of that. One thing I do want to relay to you is in all the studies we've done, before students get the final cumulative exam, we ask them, how anxious are you about this exam? And we use different measures to get at that. And what we see every time is students who have been tested repeatedly are less anxious than students who have not been tested. That's probably just because they're getting used to the fact that, oh, I know what kinds of questions to expect, I'm comfortable with the teacher's assessment style, and so when they get to that final cumulative exam, it's not so bad. What we don't know is what's happening as they're learning from the actual lecture, and using this environment is going to get us some really neat data to be able to understand what testing is doing to people as they learn from the lecture and how that might be related to how they react to later, more substantive tests. So that's sort of the gist of what we plan to do. And before I conclude, I just want to acknowledge all our collaborators at Harvard who have made all of this work possible, and also all the folks here at McMaster who have really been instrumental in helping us to figure out how we can execute this in the live lab. And so we're very excited to get involved with that. And then also the Harvard Initiative for Learning and Teaching, which has generously supported all the research I told you about today. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks so much for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering, I don't know if you have data or you can speculate how, if applying these models to an actual classroom, how grading would play into students' motivation. So is it enough to just incorporate these quizzes throughout your lectures and students are actually receiving a grade for those quizzes, or do they need to be, it's counted towards their grade?
That's a great question. My personal thought is, I think there has to be some incentive to want to perform well on these tests. So Dan Schachter actually does incorporate this into his cognitive neuroscience class now, and we sort of went back and forth discussing what's the best way, because you don't want it to be worked too much where people are too anxious during the testing. So we just make it very low stakes, and it's worth anywhere from usually about 5% of your overall grade. And so you can boost your grade by this much. You'll cut out this many quizzes just to make sure if people miss class, it's not something you're punished for. And that seems to work. And in the context of his course, I think it was, he's teaching this course with George Alvarez, who's a vision scientist at Harvard. And what they do is that halfway through their course, they ask students, do you want us to stop doing this? We'll stop doing it. And 95% of people said, no, keep doing it. It's helping me pay attention. They had no problem with the fact that part of their grade was related to it. But I think that, that's going to be up to people to figure out. That's just one thought we had. We had a conversation the other day about how, you can make with bonus points for the class, which is sort of the same idea, but maybe not framed. Maybe if you frame it a bit differently, people won't be as afraid to take tests during class.
Just a quick one, how many students were involved in the data that you were showing?
So in each of the studies, we had, I want to say, 16, 18 participants per group. So it comes out pretty nicely. They certainly weren't very extensive studies, but one thing we do want to start doing is to go into actual classroom settings to see how this translates. And we think the live labs would be a nice way to do that, where we can get much more than just, how well are they learning from this stuff, but physiological and brain imaging data that can inform that. But having much larger samples would be nice as well. Yeah.
Hi. So I actually have a question.
There you go.
I actually support this type of view. I think that it would work well for me personally. But just to play devil's advocate, you know how TV came out and they started going, oh, well, with all this fast-paced TV and now social media, our kids aren't able to focus any longer. Their focus is gone.
Yeah.
So just as a musing, do you have any thoughts of, are we taking something that's already existing and just trying to optimize learning to fit how people are nowadays? Or do you think we might be hindering the ability to pay attention in longer spurts by doing this type of thing? Any thoughts on that kind of
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One thing that we've been really interested in understanding is, so that second study I told you about, like how, in terms of the timing of the testing and how early we might want to do it. What we really want to understand too is what is the optimal delay between having to do this stuff where, can you just do it once halfway through the lecture and that's it and that's enough? Or do you have to do it when we just don't know the answer to those questions? But that's definitely something we want to play around with, because I think a lot of people have a lot of intuitions about, how long people are able to stay focused on. And it's really interesting when you talk to different groups of folks what those intuitions are. If you talk to anyone in the United States, they always say it's 10 minutes and no more. Gave a very similar talk in Denmark, and a medical doctor stood up and said, we know here in Denmark that students can't pay more attention than 40 minutes. And they truly believe that. They truly believe that. And so I think we really need data to help understand what is the answer to that. And that's, I think once we start to figure that out, we can develop better interventions where it doesn't have to be every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. But
And it sounds like some cross-cultural research can be valuable as well, because it might not be the same in each culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering whether if a student is anticipating a quiz, so if you state at the beginning of the course that there could be at least 2 or 3 quizzes per lecture.
Yeah.
If you measure their overall performance at the end of the course, if they know that there could be a quiz that day, but they're not quizzed, how that affects their performance at the end of the course.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good question. I think our data maybe speaks to that a little bit, because in our experiments, everyone's on the hook the whole time. Everyone thinks there might be a test at any given moment, and the people who don't get those tests, they really do not do too well. And I'm sure if we didn't put people on the hook, if we just said, just watch this, it would be even worse. So I think our data speak to that a little bit, that you really have to reinforce that expectation, and just simply saying that you may or may not be tested and then not giving it. I don't think that'd be as good, but that's just my hunch based on some of the things we've been finding.
One final question.
Thank you for a great talk. what was most interesting to me is how clearly you've labeled mind wandering as a lecture-based issue and how to find another mechanism for test-enhanced learning. Do you have any thoughts on other ways of productively managing mind wandering? Because this seems to be sort of a suppression of mind wandering. Is there a way to consume it, or is there something about the ideology of it that we can manage more effectively without moving to a test-based lecture?
That's a, I have like 5 different answers to that question. That's
Can I get one, please?
So, where do you start with that? So I think it depends on a lot of things, right? I think, one of the main questions we get is, do you really want to suppress mind wandering? What if it's helping them to learn? Well, I promise you, in every study we've done, we haven't had one student who's sitting there thinking like, oh, how can I apply statistics to what's going to be going on? They're thinking about what they're going to be doing tomorrow, what they're going to have for lunch, after they leave. That's when we probe them, that's what they're thinking about. And so a lot of that might depend on who the audience is, right? So if folks in this audience are mind wandering during this lecture, that's probably much better than you hanging on every word I'm saying, because if you're relating it to things that you're interested in and having ideas about, no, he's totally off base with that, I have a better idea, that's probably much more effective than just staying in the moment. And so just trying to figure out things like that in terms of like, who the audience is, what the content of the lecture is. There's probably some lectures that don't engage as much mind wandering as others. And then John and I were actually having a conversation over lunch today, just the idea of how can you redirect, if they're going to mind wander anyways, how can you redirect them to do it more effectively? And one potential idea to do this is that at the outset of the lecture, give them something to mind wander towards. Say, okay, everything I'm going to teach you today has to do with this potential situation in your life. And then see if that in any way can actually produce more positive mind wandering as opposed to something that has absolutely nothing to do with their learning and is obviously getting in the way of it. So I think there's just a lot of different